So hopefully we can help with. I'm looking at the pre-test, and so hopefully we can help everyone be able to get a perfect score on it come the end of the presentation. So I'm going to turn off my camera just so you all have a better shot of seeing my screen because my laptop sometimes can play games with me. So let's see if the sharing, okay, I think we're sharing. So there we go. Thank you, Henry. And so we're going to dive into our outlook. So we've started the season, right? We're in August. Today's the 1st of August. So we're now entering the third month of the season, and this is the first of what are typically the 3 months that see the most hurricane activity. And the outlook still remains that we're expecting an above normal season, which means that you're looking at between 13 to 19 named storms. We've had three so far this year, 6 to 10 of those becoming hurricanes, and then 3 to 5 of those reaching category 3 or higher, which is what we consider a major hurricane. Our list of names this year, we've gone through Chantal, so your next one will be Dexter, so you can prepare all of your Dexter memes and have them ready for the next storm name. I will point out this is the same list we had in 2017. Imelda replaced Irma. Melissa replaced Maria. We have Rebecca, spelled with a K, but pronounced the same, and Sebastian, it has an E instead of the A, but it is also pronounced how you're used to it being pronounced. So that's just some heads up on the names we have for the season. As we look, why does this matter, right? Well, here is every hurricane that's passed within 60 miles of Miami since our records reliably went back to 1865. And you can see there's a total of 48 storms on this map and not a lot of open real estate in South Florida. This year will make 20 years since Hurricanes Katrina and Wilma, which both are on the map. But you can kind of get a sense that hurricanes have always been part of our lives in South Florida, and we have to be ready for them. So here's a graph that shows you the activity. And here we are, August 1st, and we're about to begin our climb up to the peak of the season. Now, the basin wide peak is usually in September. However, here in South Florida, we do have a secondary peak around Columbus Day in October that we're going to have to keep an eye on. Wilma, for example, came through on October 24th of 2005. So October hurricanes, even November hurricanes aren't unheard of for us. But as we begin heading into the peak of the season, now is a great time for this discussion so we can be ready, stay ahead of it. A lot of folks will ask, okay, one of the questions we asked, right, was reliable sources and things and spaghetti plots, right? What tools can we use? And I want to talk a little bit about the cone. So the cone shows you where the storm center is going to be 2/3 of the time. The size of the cone is completely based off the average error at that time step over the last 5 years. And as you can see, back in 2005, a 5-day cone had an error of almost 400 miles. Fast forward 10 years to 2015, and that's below 300 miles. There was a massive amount of improvement and investment to try to get that smaller. So in 2015 and even through the last several years, the 5-day error has been similar to what a 3-day error was in 2005. But the cone has been on a diet, and you can see that while the errors are smaller, they are still there, but the cone does not tell you anything about the size of the storm or the area being impacted. So just something to keep in mind as we go through the presentation here. People will also ask me, Robert, which computer model on the spaghetti plot do you prefer? The European, the American model? Is there something else? And I'm always going to tell you, I prefer the human being because the forecasters look at everything and they weigh how things have been performing. And so this is an analysis on the right here, 96 hours out from landfall. This blue dot, so the bottom is consistency in nautical miles, and track error is the other axis. And so you want to be as close to down on the lower right as possible. And this is the American model, the GFS, and it's got some error and it's got some inconsistency. Over here we have the European, one of the models that the UK met, which is the United Kingdom Meteorological Office with the United States Air Force, and a little bit better. Here's the European Center model, which the United States also partakes in. We purchase the data too, and our academic institutions contribute to the research for it. But at the end of the day, here's the human forecast. And you can see it has more consistency and lower error. And the reason is because there is value to having that human interface. Across all the different time steps, this black line near the top shows you that it has one of the highest skills, if not the highest skill, at almost every single time step of the forecast going out to the fifth day. So hopefully that provides some confidence in the reason why uh, we approach this process the way that we do. We look at everything, much like an orchestra, an ensemble of different instruments playing the same music helps make things sound better. A orchestra or an ensemble of models helps us make a forecast better. So spaghetti plots, that's fine and dandy. You can get into the weeds with that. However, it's very time consuming and it doesn't help you focus on the impact. So hopefully a goal from today's presentation is you'll take away not just how to focus on the impacts, but where to get good information to help you prepare for them. But here's an example of all the different simulations that we can look at from different models, different potential possibilities to find a way. And this is just give you an example with Hurricane Ian, the blue line, right? That was kind of the middle of all the models. And yet the star over here is where it ended up making landfall. But the impacts of Ian were felt far and wide beyond just the center line. And visiting that, the tale of two hurricanes, a lot of folks want to always relate one hurricane that may be threatening us to ones that have happened in the past. And a lot of folks don't realize, but Hurricane Charlie in 2004 shared landfall points with Hurricane Ian in 2022. In fact, they made landfall almost in the exact same location. Both were category 4 hurricanes, yet they were completely different levels of impact. And so what ends up happening is that some folks thought, oh, Charlie didn't cause an issue with the water, with the surge, so I'm not going to leave. And what ended up happening was, while Charlie was a very small and violent wind hurricane, and it did produce storm surge, but the storm surge and the flooding from the rainfall were much more sequestered. They were much more localized and not as large as the larger, slower moving Ian. And so what ended up happening was the storm surge with Ian was much dramatically higher than it was with Charlie, whereas Charlie's winds were destructive much further inland as it crossed the state. But again, two different stories because of two different storms. So it's really important that we not um, that we not get stuck on, like, for example, oh, this storm looks like this one, so the impacts are going to be the same. Um, so that's something just to keep in mind there. And I point out because a lot of folks in Dade County remember Hurricane Andrew. And Andrew was a very unique storm, a lot like Charlie in some respects, of its smaller size, very intense winds, and very localized extreme storm surge impact. But we have to remember not every storm is going to be Andrew, and not, in fact, whatever other storms could potentially impact our area will be completely unique from Andrew. So Andrew is one part of the history, but it doesn't teach us everything that could happen in our area. So looking at these two storms, this is the wind field on the left, and you can see Charlie was small. It was a buzzsaw, very Andrew-like, whereas Ian, larger, weakened a bit, and then regained as it made its way across the state. The storm surge with Charlie on the left, much lower than Ian, which was much higher, especially in that same Fort Myers Beach area. The rainfall with Charlie was a lot less. It was moving faster, whereas Ian produced so much rain, it actually flooded all the roads that went between Tampa and Fort Myers, except for US 41, all the major highways were underwater. So for a couple of days, that's something to keep in mind there. Um, and then at the same time, oop, I advanced there. The forward speed, Charlie was moving much more quickly, whereas Ian was slower. So there was more time for the wind, the rain, all of those impacts to accumulate. When we talk about watches and warnings, a watch means that either hurricane conditions or life-threatening storm surge, depending if it's a hurricane watch or a storm surge watch, are possible somewhere within that area within 48 hours. Whereas a hurricane warning or a storm surge warning means that those conditions are expected somewhere within that area within 36 hours. So a watch basically means you need to complete all your preparations. A warning means your preparations need to be finishing up, they need to be done, and the impact should be you should be bracing for them. These are communication tools. So at this point, don't worry if you're in the cone or not. If there's a watch or a warning for your area, that means there's a threat and you need to take action to prepare or protect yourself from them. So I'm going to show an example again of Ian. Here's the cone for Ian. You can see it's pretty skinny, right? Yet we know that we felt some outer fringes of Ian. And you can see here the extent of the wind field. It was much larger than the cone. And it just points out the cone is only telling you about the center of the storm, but the storm is much larger than its center. Okay? So just something to keep in mind as we go through the season and in the future. Don't depend on the cone. The cone isn't really helpful to you when you're trying to assess threat. Focus on watches and warnings. Focus on the time of arrival. Focus on wind speed probabilities, the storm surge mapping, and orders from local county emergency management, and also hurricane threat impact maps. Realize we lose more people typically from storm surge than any other threat. It is the largest killer. Flooding rainfall is typically number two, though they can trade depending on the season and the storm. But we lose more people from drowning than we do from wind related impacts due to the hurricane winds or tornadoes. Okay. And I'm going to move to the next graphic set here. So the wind speed probabilities. Earlier, we asked what can help you determine a chance of tropical storm or hurricane force winds in a given area. And this is it. It actually gives you a percent range. And what's nice is you don't have to guess with this. Oh, what happens if the storm goes to the right? What happens if it goes to the left? What happens if it slows down? What happens if it speeds up? What happens if it gets stronger or if it gets weaker? This takes this all into account for you. So there's three maps. One is for tropical storm force. The next is for strong tropical storm force. And the next one is for hurricane force. And the three are available on hurricanes.gov with every advisory package, just like the cone. I highly recommend you take a look at these when we have the next threat so you can assess what the chances of experiencing any of these three thresholds. And we all know we have to prepare a little differently depending on how strong the winds could be, right? Hurricane force threat, we may need to go ahead and put up shutters. Whereas with tropical storm force winds, we may need to focus more instead of just uh, the shutters, that question, we also have to gather some other things, make sure things are secured, right? So there's different preparations depending on the threat. Another question is, what's the earliest reasonable time that those winds could arrive? And so I always explain this like if we're going to show up to a meeting, if you like being one of the first people there, making sure you have the seat selection that you'd like, whether in the front of the room, the back of the room, the side of the room, middle of the room, whatever you prefer, then maybe you want to use the earliest reasonable arrival time. This is really useful if you have a low risk tolerance. You want to have everything prepared well ahead of time to give your folks a chance to get home and take care of things there safely. On the flip side, let's say you need to go until a later time, keep operating as long as possible, you can use the most likely arrival time. Eventually, as we get closer to the event, these two times will start coming towards each other because we'll have a better idea as to what the time will be that the storm will provide impact. These are also available on hurricanes.gov with each advisory. So let's say you're like, Robert, I have all of this data, but at the end of the day, I just need something that's easy to understand so I know exactly what I should be prepared for, that I'm not surprised. And so we produce for the four hazards: storm surge, wind, tornado, and flooding rainfall. These graphics called the hurricane threat and impacts graphics. They show the potential level of impact that you should be ready for based on a reasonable worst case scenario. So it tries to give you a big picture look at what you should do. And this is an example for wind. If I see red on the map of my house, that means I have to reasonably be prepared for a hurricane. So that means I'm going to close my shutters, right? But for you and your business or your organization or your household, it all depends on what your impacts are. You can use this map to assess what that could potentially be and prepare. So I'm going to pause real quickly to make sure that if there's any questions or anything here, because this is a pretty big thing, but I just want to make sure that if there's a quick question or anything that I can clarify with this, that I give a minute or so we have a chance for it.
Okay, I don't see any question in the chat. Anybody has a question, please you can speak or put in the chat. Everything's clear.
Okay. So on this part of the presentation, there the takeaways are that hurricanes can strike any year. Andrew was actually in a relatively quiet year. Believe it or not, 1992 was not a very busy season. It was a below average uh, hurricane season in terms of the amount of activity. But we have to take every storm seriously, regardless of the category. They all bring their unique threats. So we need to not get sunk into, oh, it's only a category this, or it's only a tropical storm this, or it doesn't even have a name, blah, 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 blah. Because we know that too much rain, too much wind, tornadoes, or the storm surge threat uh, can kill people. And we also don't want to rely so much on the exact, that skinny black line. We don't want to anchor ourselves to past storms because we haven't lived long enough to see everything that has happened in South Florida. Our hurricane history has taught us that every storm brings a different threat that hasn't necessarily been seen here before. So, a lot of you may be looking at this as preparing a business or your operation for your organization, but I also want to talk about preparing your household. So the first thing that we typically talk about is knowing your zone. And a lot of South Dade, believe it or not, is low lying and at risk for storm surge. So you may live in a storm surge evacuation planning zone. Another thing is you want to make a plan. And making a plan is really important, not just for you, not just for your family, not just for your pets, not for other loved ones, not just for your business. But by having these plans for everything, related to them, it makes it really easy when you have a threat to be able to know what you need to do and be able to take those actions. The other thing is right now, it's really easy to get supplies. You can order things. We're not expecting any tropical cyclones within the next 7 days that could affect South Florida. So it's really easy if you need to get a part for your shutters, if you need to get a drill bit, if you need to get more water, if you need to get batteries, if you need to order supplies in terms of lanterns or tarps. It's really easy to do that now. You may even be able to find it in the stores. So something to think about there. The other thing is building mitigation. We have the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. Their website is flash.org. And I'm going to play this video. So I'm not sure if the audio made it through on this, but this is a campaign that the Federal Alliance for Safe Home has been working on for several years. After Hurricane Andrew, some of the building codes had to be strengthened, and they were. And this is an idea that even for existing structures, there's things you can do to help increase the resistance of it to hurricanes. And so, mitigating your home, mitigating buildings that you work at, those are steps that you can take to have preparation ahead of the hurricane. Another thing is your insurance, making sure that you know where your policies are, that you have those contacts, maybe putting it up on the cloud. So, in case you lose the papers or they get destroyed in the storm, you have access to them. A lot of the insurance companies now have apps that you can put on your phone. So, it makes it easier to report damage. And also, check with your agent. We still don't have a storm within the box. So, if you need to make updates to your insurance policies, flooding is a separate policy. Flood insurance is not typically included with your homeowner's windstorm policy. And a lot of business policies also don't include it. So make sure that you check with your insurance agent to make sure that you have the right insurance for your situation and for your budget. And also, once we do all of this, is helping our community. And I know with the extension, a lot of the folks like you that are participating in the programs, you're active in the community, you provide a lot of the support for our communities to keep them strong. And so, obviously, you stand to help your neighbors in time of need. And so, in order to do that, though, you have to be strong, you have to be ready, and you have to be doing well to be able to offer the help. So, those are all things in terms of preparing your household. Um, here's these are the storm surge planning zones for evacuation. Realize you're only typically asked to leave due to the threat of storm surge. And as you can see, a lot of South Dade is in one zone or another. Obviously, it's a very rare thing to see beyond A and B asked to leave, right? The last time any part of Zone C was asked to leave was during parts of with Hurricane Irma. But it is something that everyone should be aware of, and you should know if your home is in one of these zones. Henry brought this up earlier. You don't have to leave. You don't have to leave all the way to Georgia, or go to Orlando. If you have a family member that is outside of the zone that's asked to leave that you can stay with, or a friend, um, spend the storm with them if they're willing to host you. That's a much better thing. Tens of miles, not hundreds of miles, is a really big point to make there, because you don't have to go all the way out of the state. You don't have to go so far away. It's expensive, it's risky, it's uncomfortable. So the easier and safer you can make it for yourself to get out of harm's way with storm surge, the better you are and the better it is for everyone. So if you live in a zone, especially an A or a B, think about, do I have a friend that lives in the, outside of those zones, preferably outside of at least zone C or D. But if just try to figure that out, and see if you can find someone to stay with as part of your plan, or several people to stay with, several options. And the reason storm surge is difficult is because it assumes perfect forecast, right? And yet we won't know the perfection of the forecast till it's too late for people to leave. It's too dangerous. So we have to model it hundreds of different times for different scenarios. And this is an example for Hurricane Michael, which affected the Panhandle. Look at all of the different potential scenarios. And with that, the different storm surge impacts. So, what we do is we try to account for all the different things that can happen, and then provide a, a reasonable worst case to be prepared for. That's what your local emergency management officials will then utilize to make their decisions as to who they ask to evacuate or who can stay. It's all based off data, but realize it, at the time that it takes for everyone to pack up and leave and get out of harm's way, there's still uncertainty with the forecast that has to be accounted for. Storm surge, again, it is one of the largest killers. And you may see these maps on the web, on hurricanes.gov, on TV. And so let's go a little bit. The peak surge is the expected. It's like the 50th percentile, the mean, right? That's the forecast. And you'll see it on this map, but they don't depict, it's only along the immediate coast. It doesn't depict how far inland it's going to go. All values, when we talk about storm surge, are above normally dry ground. You don't have to worry about your elevation. We do all of that calculation for you. It's above ground level. So if it says 4 to 9 feet, it's 4 to 9 feet above ground level. Okay, you don't have to, 10 feet above this. No, we've already done that for you. We have GIS to do that. If we're telling you there's a threat and what the threat is, it's what we say it is in terms of that, in terms of the reasonable worst case over here too. So when you look at this, it's how high the water could rise above normally dry ground. It accounts for a 1 in 10 chance that it could be higher than what we're saying. So it gives you 90% of the plausible scenarios so you're prepared, and it limits the amount of risk. It doesn't represent that every single area is going to receive that level of flooding, but somewhere along that area we'll see it if the storm is forecast to enter that region. So this is an example, visual. Quick question, can you all hear the video?
No.
No? Okay, let me see if I can change that because that would help, I think. It's always a little interesting for me. Hold on, just see, I may have to, there we go.
Is a hurricane heading towards your area? If so, how do you know if you're at risk from storm surge? You can find out by looking at the potential storm surge flooding map. It provides a reasonable worst-case scenario during a specific storm, showing how high the water may rise in your neighborhood. Here's a hypothetical situation for a storm impacting the Miami area. If you live in an area highlighted in yellow, you should plan for more than 3 feet of moving water above the ground. This much water can carry away vehicles and block escape routes. In areas highlighted in orange, 6 feet of water can damage structures and roads, cutting areas off from emergency services. In areas highlighted in red, 9 feet of water can be catastrophic, with areas uninhabitable for weeks. Regardless of the amount of storm surge you may face, always follow the guidance of local officials to help ensure your safety. Is a hurricane heading towards your area?
Okay, so that video is available on our YouTube page as well. And the goal is to try to explain the map a little bit, but realize in general, Miami-Dade County does a fantastic job of analyzing the data, and they're able, when they ask you to leave, and they'll have maps available where you can even type your address and see if your home or your location is in an evacuation order. Um, it really makes it easy. You don't need to struggle with like, okay, what is going on? Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? On the flip side, businesses, um, small business in particular, but small to medium sized business is the lifeblood economically of our communities. And we know that after a natural disaster, 40% of small businesses do not reopen immediately after. And 1 year later, 25% more of the businesses that were able to reopen fail. So immediately you lose 40%. Of that remaining 60%, you lose 25% within a year. So that's a significant, you could lose over half of the small businesses in a community after it's affected by a natural disaster. That is something that is extremely, extremely difficult economically for a community. And 3 years later, businesses without a continuity percent, 75% of them fail. And that is staggering, because realize, without small business, without that employment, without that economic engine, it's very hard for a community to recover. We all remember, for those of us that were around after Andrew, how hard it was for South Dade to get back on its feet. The loss of the Air Force Base, the loss of so much business, so many people, moving out of the area when a lot of the structures were uninhabitable. It was very disruptive. And so the goal is, in order to make recovery easier, we need to have strong households, but also strong businesses. And so there is a toolkit that you can use, Ready Business Hurricane Toolkit. You can also have it on flash.org. There's a Ready Business section, and you can click on hurricane. They have other disaster plans. But for the hurricane, there's 6 S's. And you start with your staff. So very much like we just spoke about in terms of strengthening your households, right? Having a plan, but doing that with your staff, that's really important. The surroundings of the business. You all have large amounts of outdoor environment that you take care of, that you're responsible for. That's really important. That's the start of a foundation of your plans, probably. But the next thing is also the spaces that you work in, both indoor and outdoor. Those spaces are important, because if they aren't protected, if they're not strengthened and they're lost, all of a sudden it could create a very difficult time in the recovery of not just the business, but the community in general. Your systems, not just the systems like computer systems, or maybe the things that you use to keep inventory, but also the systems that you use for safety, right? If you don't have the same functions, the same sensors, things aren't working the way they should. Your equipment, what if it's not in working order and you need it, right? If it got flooded or something like that, impacted it, tornado lofted it or threw it on its side. Those are things that can be very disruptive. The structures that you work in. After Andrew, we saw a lot of destruction of structures, but even if you lost the roof of your office, how would that work? Would you be able to function with a temporary solution? Would everyone be working out of a pickup truck? These are questions that you may want to think about, like, what would be our backup plan? And then service, not just to your customers and the community, but potentially, you know, in the recovery, right? You may have business opportunities related to the recovery that are really important, and you want to make sure. So these are all things that are tackled in the plan. And obviously you start with your people and you work your way through, but this all can really help you, because 50% of small businesses, or excuse me, small businesses employ 50% of all private sector employees, and small businesses are 99% of all companies. So it's a really big deal to get small businesses back online, to be able to get our communities rebuilt and back to normal. So I had opened the floor for a few questions. I just want to make sure if there aren't any more questions right now. Wanted to open the floor back up. I see the chat. I appreciate everyone been interacting, Henry, and for putting up the links, sharing those, because these are tools that are available. We want to make sure that everyone has access to the information and can complete preparations or make a plan and feel comfortable that they have access to resources.
Thank you very much, Robert. Does anybody has any question? The meeting is a little quiet.
Maybe they're all having lunch.
Mhm.
Okay, before the post test, Henry, I'm gonna make one more quick point. How has the Miami office been faring with all the budget cuts? That's a good question, Elise. We're here and
Mm.
we're ready to serve. We have our mission to meet, so we're doing okay. So I'm sharing my screen again real quick, and I'm just going to make this point. All of our strongest hurricanes in the last 100 years that have affected the United States were tropical storms 3 days before they made landfall. So think how you would handle this scenario. Sunday morning, you're heading off to church, drinking your coffee, and this tropical depression forms in between Jamaica and Cuba. There's a little bit of green, between 5 to 10% of tropical storm force winds in the next 5 days in South Dade there. How would you handle this? Okay. When people ask me what keeps me up at night, this is kind of that scenario. Most people would monitor it here, right? Keep an eye on things. See the difference between the cone and the wind speed probabilities? This is the most likely time of arrival graphic, by the way. Ah, Samuel is ahead of where we're going with this. What if here's Tuesday evening, 11 p.m. We were having a Category 5 hurricane about to enter Biscayne Bay. Samuel asks, how prepared is South Florida stormwater infrastructure for a Cat 5? I think it's as prepared as it can be. We currently are in quite a drought, especially in western portions of Miami-Dade County. So we can handle quite a bit of rainfall. But the thing is, realize that if you get 20 inches of rain, or let's say more than 10 inches of rain just about anywhere, is going to cause problems. Areas saturate. So the stormwater infrastructure, again, our levels right now are pretty low, Samuel, but it still can get overwhelmed with enough rainfall. It just will take much more rainfall to get overwhelmed, for the time being at least. So this is just something to think about. How would you prepare for this? How would you handle the changes, right, of the forecast rapidly going from we don't know if this could survive its crossing Cuba to okay, it crossed Cuba and now it's in the warm waters? Someone asked me here, are you seeing an increase in the quickness of storm development? I feel like they're intensifying more rapidly than before. And yes, Brooke, that is something that we are, um, that is something that we worry about, that we grapple with. That is the forecast science problem right now, right? And that's what this scenario is attacking. And that's where mitigation, right? Being ready, having your plan, being able to get that plan executed quickly really makes a difference. Samuel, I think we have some advantages compared to New Orleans um, with the flooding. One is while we're relatively flat, we are also not below sea level. And realize that we don't build a lot of things in the floodplain typically here. So this year we're facing new planning challenge, how to keep water out of a structure and time frame for deployment. And that's where the challenge is with storm surge. When we build things, right, we have to keep them above the 1%, the one they call the 100-year floodplain, but it's that 1% chance of flooding annually. But at the same time, you have to consider, this is something, for example, City of Key West has been doing a lot of work with this. If you know that portions of a building are potentially at risk, why not use building materials where all you have to do after a surge event is hose it out? Just wash it out, clean it. Why do we have to use drywall? Right? Some of these tiger dams we saw with Tampa General Hospital, the deployment of um, these temporary dam structures, right? So that's where the planning, the preparation, all of that can come into, they are expensive for homeowners, absolutely. And that's where we have to assess the risk and what is reasonable to prepare for. Obviously, the insurance is part of it, making sure you have flood insurance. But at the same time, as you do improvements to your property, continue to think about mitigation. It's not an easy answer. And that rapid intensification, we're going with 14 mil sheeting at the present time. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people think sandbags are an answer, and they're kind of like a placebo sometimes. They're maybe not going to give you the amount of security that you would like. It's not waterproof. So, but with that, Henry, I think to let them have a chance at the post test.
I have
Appreciate the back and
I,
forth.
I have a question for you.
Mhm.
What about the king tide? I mean, you have any event with the king tide? At the same time, what happened?
Yeah, obviously, king tide season, September, October, right, tends to be a much more active part, and it is something that we have to consider. And it is accounted for with the storm surge modeling. That's part of the input, right? Is like what are the water levels? Because king tides can be forecast. But one thing that we find is that what could be a nuisance flooding event with a king tide, right, where it's bothering parking lots, docks, all of a sudden, especially if we've had rain, we're already saturated, it becomes more than a nuisance. It starts to bother people's businesses, it starts to bother people's homes and the property. And so that's where those steps to mitigate are really important. But okay, when we have a king tide event, we could try to give a heads up, and we typically do, right? You'll see maybe a coastal flood statement or a coastal flood advisory out. But when you add in the fact that there's hurricane potentially thrown into the mix, that's part of the forecast process. So even if there isn't a storm surge risk necessarily, if there is a king tide risk where that water level is higher, we may even have to issue a coastal flood warning, right? To let people know that those water levels are going to be higher, and to move what they need to out of harm's way or implement the protective barriers, if they have any, for property that can't be moved. So those are the kinds of things that are difficult because we have a lot of folks that have put a lot of very valuable things in areas that will occasionally become wet. And that's where having this conversation now, going, people doing their planning and saying, okay, what can we do to protect things? What can we do to make it less expensive to restore normalcy? Choosing different building materials. Um, Another thing is people don't think about how much impervious surface they have. That makes a big difference with flooding. Um, some you can plant. I know some people are like allergic to mangroves. It feels like, but you can use natural plant life to also help with that, to serve as a barrier against that water. Mangroves really do help lessen the surge. So those are things that you can investigate. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect, and you shouldn't have people in harm's way, but at least it can lessen the wave action that heads into the property, which potentially could make it slightly less destructive, and a little easier to start recovery from.
All right, guys. So let's do here quick the post test, and we can discuss the questions. Can you see the questions?
I see the pre, but it could just be me. Oh, there we go. Maybe the post is there. Okay, it looks like the post is up.
Right. Do you want to go over the answers, Robert? I think
Absolutely.
we have two or 3 minutes.
So number one was, what percentage of the time could the center of a storm venture outside of the forecast cone? And 52% of you got it right. You said 33%. Yep. 2/3 of the time, the center of the storm should stay inside of that cone, but there's going to be a third of the time where it could venture outside of there statistically. So 33% it is for number one. Which National Hurricane Center product can help me determine the chance of tropical storm or hurricane force winds in a given area? And 56% of you did wind speed probabilities. This one is a massive change compared to the pretest, where a lot of folks were choosing pretty much everything else but
Mm.
wind speed probabilities. So I'm glad to see the trend there. Which of these is not a reliable source of hurricane information? And this one was a little bit of a trick question, but y'all got it right. Random social media pages. That's not typically a reliable source of hurricane information. And then which hurricane threat is often the deadliest? Storm surge, number one on there. Flooding rainfall, number two. And yeah, typically water will kill people in higher numbers than wind, but all four of those threats we need to respect. Storm surge and flooding rainfall tend to be 1 and 2 most years, unfortunately, but we keep trying to bring those numbers down. So appreciate everyone today, Henry. Appreciate that. Um, it really helps us.
Thank you very much. We have a last question here from Luisa. I wonder how can people be instructed on using vegetation because it seems they are afraid of trees and mangroves.
Yeah, and that's hard, right? Because people look at it and say, "Oh, these, the mangroves, X, Y, or Z." And obviously, growing up in South Florida, mangroves are something that I'm used to, and they're comforting because when I say mangroves, that means that it's a natural, more natural area, right? Um, so I think one of the things that I have seen in public communications that really helps is demonstrations of it. And the the Children's Museum of Science over in Fort Myers, um, it used to be the Imaginarium, and I'm going to share my screen really quickly here. They had a demonstration they did on one of the television stations. Actually, let me share it with the audio in Fort Myers, and maybe this can give everyone an idea as to how to message this to the public.
Here's at the IMAG History and Science Center, and we're doing very interactive experiments through Hurricane Week to explain the science of hurricanes. This experiment is a little bit different. I'm joined with Amy Lovelace. She's the Director of Education here at IMAG. Amy, welcome. We've had some pretty exciting experiments so far this week, and it looks like we've got a coastline in a container.
We do. So we have our ocean here, we have our beach here, we have all of our animals living here. But the only difference between this coastline is that this area is just bare sand, and this area is a mangrove forest. Now obviously we don't have real mangroves in this little tank.
That's pretty close.
But we do have some pipe cleaners that we've put together to make into mangroves. So if you want to do this at home, simple little way to make a little mangrove forest, just twisting some pipe cleaners together and putting them directly in the sand.
And obviously we have a lot of these in Southwest Florida, mangroves, which we rely on, especially as it comes to storm surge to help protect us. So let's. So what do you want me to do here?
So we have a glass, and that's going to be our wave generator.
Okay.
So what you're going to do is you're just going to put it in the water and push back and forth a few times to create waves.
All right.
And we'll see as those
So
waves start eroding our shore.
Okay, it's pretty good. Oh, we lost some mangroves.
And
That's
if we're taking a look at our shoreline, our animals on this side are already washing into the water. But our animals that have the mangroves on their side are pretty well protected. They're just getting their toes wet. But our animals on this side are dealing with a little bit more storm surge, a little more devastation on.
So I think whenever we talk about this publicly, and our office has a tank for flooding to show what happens when there's too much impervious surface as well. We've deployed it at the Dade County Youth Fair for several years, and that is something that the public education, right? It's the same reason why we talk about the canopy, the urban canopy, helping lower the heat that's reaching and lower the temperatures, cool it down. Why is it important to not cut down every tree that may be inconvenient, right? So those are all efforts, public education wise, that we have to do. But yeah, not mess with the dunes. A lot of people, you look at Miami Beach, there's not a ton of dune left, but granted, Miami Beach is a little different. But there are legal protections for some things, including mangroves. But obviously, that's just part of the equation. The public education side, the sharing of that knowledge, making it accessible, right? If you see this on television, you can't but help leaving, okay, and I understand why mangroves are so important with storm surge.
You bet.